So in this presentation and the next one, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how political scientists study public opinion. In this video, I want to talk to you about where we think political attitudes come from. And I'm going to start with a picture that we call the funnel of causality. Now, typically when you think of a funnel, you think of it as being like this, where you've got kind of a V-shaped going up and down. But for political scientists, when we think about the funnel of causality, we're thinking about something that goes from wide to narrow. I can't do that very well. From wide to narrow over time. So this is a visual representation of what we would call the funnel of causality. And what I want you to notice here is that on the left side of this graphic, we've got a really wide opening. And I want you to think about the very leftmost side of the funnel of causality as before you're born, like well before you're born. And as we move over to the right and that opening gets smaller and smaller and smaller until on the far right it says vote, this is time. So much like a funnel that's going from wide at the top to narrow at the bottom, here we're going from wide before you're born to narrow the day you cast a vote. And the funnel of causality is trying to explain all the different pressures, influences, factors that have an impact on for whom you will cast a vote. So on the far left there, you'll see that we have economic structure, we have social divisions, and we have historical patterns. So these are all the things that were existing before you were even born. You were born into a particular economic system and a particular class system. You were born into a world with pre-existing social divisions. This could be racial or ethnic. They could be economic. They could be religious. They could be any number of things, political ideology. And finally, you're born at a particular moment in history that is informed by the things that came before that moment. So, for example, my grandmother was born just before the Great Depression. And so she lived through the Great Depression. She lived through World War II. And that influenced the way that she parented my mom. And so that historic pattern would have an influence on the way my mom would develop attitudes about the world. And then that would have an impact on how I develop attitudes about the world. Not necessarily saying that we're going to be identical to those who came before us, but those influences are kind of baked into the world that we grow up in. So you can imagine that you're born about the point that those arrows converge at value orientations. So all of those different things, this theory says, contribute to the values that become really important to us, as well as the groups that we become loyal to. Those things aren't expressly political. The things that we value and the groups that we feel closest to, that's more about finding out who we are as people, our identity. And they're not usually expressly political, although they can be. But all of them combine to lead us to some sort of party attachment. Now, that may not be like, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, because most of us don't feel that way. We live in a world that's kind of critical of political parties. But we have feelings about them, and we have feelings about which one we're definitely not a member of, and which one we can tolerate, sometimes even like. Everyone has this, even if your attachment is, I don't like any of them, but the least worst is that one. That's the party attachment, and it tends to come, this theory suggests, from all of that stuff that was kind of there before we were born, the values that become important to us in childhood, and the groups that we identify ourselves with. That party attachment has, you'll notice in the funnel, a direct line influence on the person for whom we will vote on election day. But other things come into the mix to shift that perhaps a little bit. So you could see party attachment as being like the direction that you set your ship in the sea. I don't know, I've never sailed, but it's the direction you're going. But then things like wind and other ships and waves might drift you a little bit from side to side. And so that's what all this other stuff is. Things like what the government is doing, what has been happening in the campaign, your friends, what they think, the media that you consume, what it says, all the different political and economic conditions that exist just before you cast a ballot, as well as the issue positions and what you think personally of the candidates who are in the race. All of those things will come in to potentially shift you off course of that party attachment. But the authors of this theory, Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, in their seminal book, The American Voter, said that primarily it's your party attachment. That's your standing decision, they said. And then all these other things can shift it a little bit. But you're probably going to go back to that party attachment, whatever it is, however weak or strong it is, after this election cycle. So I'm really interested in this. This is one of the things that I study, and it's one of the things that I find really fascinating, trying to figure out where do our political beliefs come from and how are they influenced? Because the question that's always niggled at me a bit is, why do some people have really extreme beliefs and other people don't? And so this research, this literature, takes us way back to the beginning, those value orientations, and asks, is it only the stuff that's happening in the world that influences what our values are? Or is it something perhaps even more basic about who we are as people? So this week I've asked you to read a chapter from a book called Predisposed, which is about whether or not we can find any kind of physiological explanation for some of the behaviors that might influence our political opinions. Now, I just used a really long phrase there. Notice I didn't say that there's a gene that makes you liberal or conservative. There's a gene that makes you Republican or Democrat. What I'm saying is that we have these baked in physiological behaviors that we can't control. How much you scream when you're frightened is not usually something that you consciously control, because it's an automatic reflex. So I'm going to show you some studies here that are fairly bizarre if you've never seen anything like this before, but I think they're fascinating. And the first one is called Nursery School Personality and Political Orientation 2 decades later. So in this article, Block and Block recruited a team of graduate students to go into nursery schools and observe kids who were 3 and 4 years old. And they looked at what kinds of behaviors they showed when they interacted with the other kids and the teachers at these nursery schools. And they looked at boys and girls separately, and they basically had a checklist of behaviors. So some of them are here on the screen. They did this for boys and for girls, and then 20 years later, they found those kids and gave them questionnaires about their political beliefs. And they wanted to see, is there a relationship between the behaviors that you engage in when you're 3 or 4 years old and how you think about the political world 20 years later? Now, obviously, if you're a boy, you don't say, well, I'm a Republican, so I'm going to behave this way. These are all really just normal social behaviors. And the question is there some sort of relationship? Now, this study was pretty small, and if you've taken statistics, you know that when you have a small number of subjects, the ability to distinguish differences between groups becomes much harder. And so the fact that the researchers were able to find any consistent patterns suggests that there's something going on here. I would never tell you to believe one study in isolation, but we're going to look at a few of these. And so what I'm going to ask you to do here is look at these two groups. I'm going to show you the boys and then the girls. So group 1 for boys and girls, they all grew up to have the same political ideology. And group 2 for the boys and girls, they all grew up to have the other political ideology. And I want you to try to guess which one of these groups grew up to be liberal and which ones grew up to be conservative. So take a look at group 1 here. In group 1, these boys were really confident. They were independent. They tend to be the go-getters of the nursery school. So they kind of came up with what we're going to do next. They're really proud and very much engaged in whatever they're doing. Group 2, they were much more the followers. So they would look to other people to tell them what to do. They got very nervous when they didn't know what was going to happen next. They tended to be a little suspicious of other people. They worried a lot, and they felt guilty more easily. Now, you may be saying, hey, group 1 is all positive, group 2 is all negative. That's just because the boys were less consistent. Let's look at the girls, and then I'm going to ask you to guess which one's which. So here, group 1, again, group 1 is the same direction as the boys. The girls in group 1 were much more talkative and independent, but they were also much more competitive. They needed to be the center of attention. They blamed everyone else before they would ever take responsibility. They teased other children. They were more aggressive physically and verbally, even though they were also confident and curious and took more initiative. So those are the girls. I like to think of those as like the drama queens of the schoolyard. The group 2 here, again, same as the boys, they also were more anxious when they didn't know what was going to happen. They felt guilty more easily. But they were also the kind who did what they were told. They were very neat and orderly. They were fine being alone. They kept to themselves. And they preferred nonverbal as opposed to verbal communication. So the question is here, what does your instinct tell you? Which one of these groups of kids will grow up to be liberal and which ones will grow up to be conservative? So let me show you the answer. In both cases, group 1, these were the liberal kids, the kids who grew up to be liberal. I have to be very careful about how I say that. And group 2 were the kids who grew up to be conservative. And this points at something that we know from the voluminous literature on political beliefs and ideology. What we know is that liberals tend to be much higher in a personality trait called openness to new experience. They like to experiment, they like to engage, they like to try things out, whereas conservatives are really comfortable with what they know. It's working. I may not love it, but something new could be even worse. So I'm going to stick with what I know. So, conservatives tend to go to the same restaurants and order the same things, whereas liberals want to try a new restaurant and go to this quirky little hole in the wall. Okay, I want to tell you quickly about two other studies that are in the same, two other studies in the same vein. They were both reported in the same paper, The Secret Lives of Liberals and Conservatives. So in the first part of this, they brought in some college students, and they told the college students that they wanted to talk to them about what they thought of a very popular movie that was showing at the time. So the movies were things like Pulp Fiction and The Shawshank Redemption, As Good as It Gets, The Green Mile, like good movies. And so they brought them into the lab and they had a conversation with each one of these students that was videotaped, and it was a conversation with a graduate student. So they were basically just asking them questions about what they thought about the movie. But what they were really looking at was body language, so nonverbal communication. As Dr. Donna Beagle says, we cannot not communicate. So the body language is going to tell us something about how people feel in this conversation. In one group, the students were pausing more, perhaps to collect their thoughts. They were a little distracted. They weren't making direct eye contact with the interviewer. The other group was much more likely to face the person they were talking to. They talked a lot more, and they smiled more often, suggesting that they were more relaxed. And the question is, which one of these groups is conservative and which one is liberal? And the answer, as you might have guessed, is that the group that's conservative is a little bit more suspicious. They don't really get what's going on here. And they're going to be a little bit more suspicious about what exactly is happening. Why is there a video camera over there? And what are you going to do with that? And what are you really trying to do here? Whereas the liberals were like, hey, you want to talk to me? Let's talk. And we're happy to do so without as much fear about kind of what's going on here. This is unfamiliar. I don't get it. The final part of this study, which I think is fascinating, has to do with how college students decorate their dorms. So they got permission from college students to just go into their dorm rooms with a checklist and note what they observed. And then separately, those same college students were given questionnaires about their political ideology. And so in one group, the students had a lot more sports decor. They had more flags and alcohol bottles, and they had irons and ironing boards and laundry baskets, event calendars, etc. The other group had just an explosion of books and music, and they had some international maps, some movie tickets, cultural memorabilia. And the question is, which group is liberal and which group is conservative? I'm guessing by now you could guess, though, based on everything we've learned, that the liberals, because they're so much more interested in having these new and novel experiences, are much more likely to have things like a wide variety of music and books and maps. And the conservatives are like, we need to, plan event calendars. We want to show what's important to us. So sports decor and flags, especially a US flag. So these different studies are not suggesting that there's, again, like you're born to be liberal or conservative. They're showing that there are clusters of things about us that correlate with being liberal and conservative. And where those come from is really, really interesting. So I don't want you to just discard this because it feels implausible or maybe even a little threatening. We like to think that we're logical creatures who evaluate the evidence and decide what we believe in based on logic. This research suggests that there's something else happening inside of us that's pushing us in directions that we may not even be conscious of. That could be really threatening. But this is what the chapter this week is really all about. And so I'm really curious to hear what you think about that when we chat this week. All right, the next video will talk about whether or not we're polarized and what evidence we have to suggest we are or are not.